Who did he think he was? A corrupt, racist cop standing in the middle of the street looking down on everyone? But unexpectedly, the guy he thought was the target turned out to be the governor of the state. "You don't know who I am, do you?" David coldly threw his badge in the cop's face. The crowd witnessed it, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and frustration. The cop thought he had power, but the price he'd pay would be his entire reputation. On the busy streets of the city, the atmosphere that afternoon seemed calm, yet tense. Beneath the lush green trees, sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting sparkling streaks of light on the pavement. David Miles, a well-dressed black man, stood silently outside a cafe. His eyes seemed unfamiliar, as though he were searching for someone in the crowd, but his mind was restless. A sense of unease lingered within him, not only because of the appointment, but also due to the persistent feeling that haunted him whenever he entered this neighborhood. This was a bustling downtown area where sometimes strange or unfriendly gazes would meet him. He stood waiting while pedestrians passed by. The crowd seemed indifferent to each other's presence, yet David always felt like an outsider. Just then, a patrol car slowly cruised by and stopped near where David stood. From inside the car, a young police officer stepped out. Officer Jackson, a confident-looking young cop, appeared arrogant as he adjusted his cap and stared directly at David, as if he had already picked his target. Without any greeting or clear reason, the officer approached and stopped right in front of him. "Can I see your ID?" the officer asked, his tone dismissive, as though such questions were his entitlement. David frowned slightly, trying to stay calm. There was no reason for him to show his ID. It was simply the curiosity of this young officer. However, he didn't want his frustration to influence his actions, knowing that resistance now could only make the situation more tense. He took a step back, the smell of gasoline from the patrol car lingering in the air, and in his mind he recalled past encounters like this one, where he always felt like an outsider. "I'm just waiting for a friend. I haven't done anything wrong," David said calmly, though a rising sense of injustice filled him. But the officer didn't let up. "Who do you think you are?" he sneered as he looked David up and down, his gaze full of contempt. "You don't belong here. People like you aren't allowed to stand here." The words hit David like a slap in the face, but he didn't react immediately. Racist comments like this weren't new to him, and he knew this was just another attempt to degrade him because of his skin color. The crowd began to stop, their curious gazes following the scene, but no one spoke up. A few people glanced over, but quickly turned away, not wanting to get involved. Officer Jackson grew more smug as he noticed no one in the crowd dared to speak out. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but with a challenging tone. "Do you have your papers? If not, you're coming with me," the officer said. His hands clenched at his waist, where his police radio emitted strange sounds, as if things were about to escalate. But this time, David didn't just stand still. He had made up his mind. Instead of reacting with anger or harsh words, David took a blue card from his pocket, the governor's badge that he always carried for situations like this. He held the card high for the officer to see clearly. "I hold the power of this state," David said firmly, yet without anger. "And I don't want to use my power to settle this, but if you keep acting like this, I'll be forced to do so." David's words hit Officer Jackson like a powerful shock. The officer stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what he had just heard. He looked at the badge, then back at David, his expression clearly one of disbelief. The people around them didn't dare to move, and a heavy silence enveloped the entire block. They had never imagined that a black man could be the governor of the state. The officer, once confident in his actions, now felt completely confused and disoriented. But that wasn't enough to make Jackson stop. He still refused to believe the truth he was facing. However, realizing he could no longer treat this as a routine matter, he took a step back. Though he still clung to the need to maintain his authority, David said nothing more, simply standing still and looking at the officer, his gaze both resolute and patient. He knew there was nothing else he needed to do in this situation, as the truth was now clear, and it was time for the officer to face the consequences of his prejudice and abuse of power. Officer Jackson looked at the badge David had just handed him, his eyes widening in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This information didn't match what he had imagined. about a black man standing on the sidewalk of such an upscale neighborhood? Uncertainty spread across his gaze, causing his steps to slow. He pulled out his phone and began to double-check the information David had provided, trying to verify if there was any mistake. However, as he read the details on the system, his face turned pale as the truth gradually became clear. David Miles was indeed the governor of the state, someone he had heard of but never imagined he'd meet in person. But even after realizing the truth, Officer Jackson couldn't accept that he had been easily outmaneuvered by David. In his moment of confusion, he didn't know what to do next. However, something inside him still urged him to maintain the power he believed he had. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, and looked around the street, where passers-by had started to stop and take notice. The crowd began to gather around them, and the curious stares from the onlookers only added to Jackson's feeling of pressure from all sides. One person in the crowd, seeming to recognize David, immediately pulled out their phone and began taking pictures. "Thank you, Governor," the person said, eyes still fixed on the phone screen. This act was like a small but powerful shock, pushing everything to a new level. The officer immediately felt the tension in the air grow thicker. He felt as if he was being watched not only by David, but by the entire community. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, silent conversations about the officer's actions and the injustice they were witnessing. Each word felt like a knife to Jackson's pride. He tried to shake off the embarrassment by turning to face David once more, but this time his gaze was no longer as confident as before. "Who do you think you are?" Jackson said, his voice full of challenge. "Do you think you don't have to follow the law? What right do you have to act like this?" The officer's questions, though arrogant, also reflected his insecurity. Police officers are always taught that they are the ones in control, but now he was facing an entirely different situation. A man, a governor, stood before him like an immovable wall, not easily swayed. The crowd now began to feel the palpable tension. Some exchanged glances, their eyes silently communicating a message that only the witnesses could truly understand. Perhaps they also saw what Jackson couldn't. David wasn't just an ordinary man. He was the governor of a state, holding power that Jackson never thought he would have to confront. But instead of looking at the officer with anger or fear, David maintained his composure, showing no sign of wavering. David looked straight into the officer's eyes without hesitation. His words carried no weakness. On the contrary, they were a declaration of resolve. "You don't know who I am," David said, each word striking down the officer's arrogance like a hammer. "And that's the problem." These words marked the end of the officer's challenge. In that moment, the crowd fell silent. They didn't hear the anger in David's voice, but they heard the powerful assertion of authority he had just made. The witnesses may not fully understand what was happening, but they could feel the shift in the air. Officer Jackson stood there, unable to respond. He felt as if David had pushed him into a corner with no way out. The truth he didn't want to admit had come crashing down, and the harder he tried to hold on to his power, the more helpless he became. The people in the crowd were no longer just passers-by. They had become living witnesses to this story. They saw the change, and their gazes were no longer innocent as they once were. David didn't need to say another word. He had said enough. This officer, though holding power, was now facing an undeniable reality. He was not the only one who held authority in this society. David Miles wasn't just the governor. He represented all those who had been oppressed, discriminated against, and looked down upon by the system simply because of their skin color. And now, David stood firm, staring the officer in the eye, not allowing this injustice to continue. The crowd, now not just observing, had become a part of the story, and the events to follow would reshape the way they viewed justice, racism, and power in society. David Miles's story would no longer just be the story of one man, it would be the story of a community, fighting to be respected and recognized. Officer Jackson stood still for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the governor badge that David had just handed him. All he could feel at that moment was utter confusion. Questions, doubts about his purpose and intentions began to swirl in his mind, but he couldn't stop himself. In Jackson's world, he was the one in control of every situation. How could a black man, someone he considered undeserving of respect, make him feel so disoriented? Finally, despite the lingering surprise, the officer decided he would continue to control the situation. He couldn't let David slip away without some consequence. Officer Jackson paused, adjusted his cap, and then moved closer to David with a challenging attitude. He didn't speak a word, simply placing his hand on David's body as if to force him into cooperating with a body search. This was the action the officer had decided on, and in his mind it would restore his control. But David didn't move, didn't resist. He stood firm, looking directly at the officer with no fear or confusion. It was determination, the strength of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He didn't feel the need to explain or respond to this abuse of power, because he knew that if he did, those who abused their authority would never stop. David didn't want things to go on the way the officer thought he could control the situation. He knew this wasn't just his personal confrontation, but a fight for a system that needed change. Jackson didn't stop. He continued pressing his hand against David's body, an act as though trying to force him into compliance. Still, David didn't budge. His hands remained firm and steady, without any resistance. Jackson felt as if everything was crumbling beneath his feet, and even though he wanted to maintain control, David wouldn't give him the chance. Jackson began to feel the confusion rise within him as passers-by stopped and began watching with curious eyes. He realized he had completely lost control of the situation. The crowd around them no longer remained silent. A few people started speaking out against the officer's actions. "This is abuse of power," a man in the crowd shouted angrily. A woman couldn't hold back either and spoke up. "The police can't behave like this. We must speak out." Comments like these only increased the tension in the air. The story was no longer just a confrontation between David and the officer, but a confrontation between justice and abuse of power. A small argument broke out among the witnesses, with some defending David while others stood quietly, too afraid to speak up but only observing. But Jackson still refused to give up. He tried to regain some of the power he had left in this situation. He turned to the people in the crowd and bitterly said, "Just stand there. Everyone must follow the law. You don't understand." These words only made David stronger. He didn't need to explain or argue further, but he didn't want the officer to continue imposing his authority on him so easily. Then, at the height of the tension, David took his phone out of his pocket, a simple action but one that carried tremendous power. He began recording video right in front of the officer, slowly directing the camera toward Jackson. This only further confused Officer Jackson. He looked at David, unsure of what to do. A video. Everything would be recorded. He couldn't deny the presence of the witnesses anymore. David wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had been oppressed or discriminated against. Fear began to creep into Jackson's heart as he realized he was not just facing David, but public opinion as well. Everything was being recorded, and any wrong move he made would be exposed immediately. The officer began to pull his hand away, but knew it couldn't change anything now. He had gone too far. What was supposed to be a routine body search had turned into a public humiliation. The crowd fell silent. Everyone was watching what was happening, and at that moment, no one could turn a blind eye. David kept recording the officer, saying nothing more. The phone in his hand had become a powerful tool to protect himself and expose the truth. Those around him could see clearly now. The officer was not the only one with power in this situation, and the witnesses were no longer passive onlookers. They were witnesses, ready to speak out when injustice occurred. And so, everything was set. Jackson could never go back to how things were. Every move he made from this point on would be closely monitored, not only by David but by everyone present. And through his actions, David made it clear justice would not remain silent and injustice could no longer continue. This time, the officer was not only challenged by David, but by the transparency he could not avoid. The story wouldn't end here, but David knew he had made people reconsider what they had seen, and that could be the start of a larger change. The atmosphere on the street immediately began to change as David raised the governor's badge, drawing the attention of everyone present. The people in the crowd, who had been indifferent to the situation at first, started to turn back, pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The light from their screens illuminated their faces, making David feel as if they were no longer standing alone. The story was no longer just a confrontation between him and the officer. It had become a public exhibition, where everyone witnessed the injustice that Jackson was carrying out. Some people immediately began criticizing the officer, demanding that he stop abusing his power and respect the rights of the citizens. But Jackson, still refusing to stop, continued trying to control the situation. The officer moved closer to David once more, frustration rising as he realized he was being challenged from all sides. He wanted to regain control, but with each move he only made the situation more tense. Jackson felt his insecurity growing as he noticed the increasingly harsh looks from those around him. The witnesses were no longer silent. They started speaking out, some even exerting strong pressure, demanding that the officer stop the body search, clearly recognizing that he was acting improperly. The tension began to rise, and the air grew suffocating. The crowd was no longer standing still. A few people began to move closer, speaking out against the officer's actions. A woman in the crowd could no longer bear it and shouted angrily, "The police have no right to do this." Her words resonated like a wave sweeping through the crowd. Others began to shout, unable to watch this scene without protesting. The criticisms grew louder, and all eyes turned to Officer Jackson, who now could no longer maintain control. Meanwhile, David remained firm, unmoving, his eyes calm and resolute. He didn't need to say anything more. David's steadfastness had created a domino effect. The emotions of the crowd had ignited, and now no one could stand by as indifferent bystanders. The police, who were meant to uphold the law, had now become the target of public criticism. At that moment, someone in the crowd recognized David. He shouted in disbelief, and the entire crowd seemed to be shaken. "That's the governor!" he yelled, causing all eyes to turn toward David. There was no longer any doubt this was not an ordinary man, but the governor, someone everyone knew but never imagined would be in the midst of such a confrontation. His words echoed, spreading throughout the block. All eyes were not only on David, but even Jackson could not ignore the truth. The officer could no longer hold on to his smug and arrogant demeanor. The crowd began to fall silent, but in that silence, the awakening was louder than ever. David's gaze remained fixed on the officer. He wasn't the slightest bit confused. In that moment, he knew that justice had spoken. The officer could no longer stand by the rules he once believed in. The entire crowd, from the witnesses to those who had spoken out, all realized that this wasn't just a personal conflict. It had become a struggle for power, for justice, and against racism. They saw the discrimination and abuse of power in the officer's actions and could no longer stand by. The truth had been exposed. A black man, not the one being controlled, but the governor of the state, was the one with power and respect in this society. At that moment, the crowd was no longer just a group of bystanders. They had become witnesses. They weren't only witnessing the officer's abuse of power, but also David's strong resistance to this injustice. And in that moment, no one dared look away. Everything that happened had turned into a clear lesson about power and equality in society. Officer Jackson had not only lost power in this moment, but also the respect he once held. The crowd fell silent for a moment, but in that silence, something stronger than any noise was the awakening. They saw that no matter how powerful someone was, they could still be confronted with the unexpected, and David, with his calm demeanor, had shown that true power doesn't come from making others fearful, but from standing up to injustice and defending justice. In that moment, everything seemed to pause, and Jackson, the officer who thought he could control everything, now realized that he couldn't extinguish the fire he had unintentionally sparked. Officer Jackson stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. Moments earlier, he still thought his power was unshakable, that as long as he wore the uniform and maintained an arrogant attitude, everyone would comply. But now, he realized he had made a huge mistake. David Miles, the black man he had considered invisible, merely a target for his power, was the governor of the state. All the control he had tried to maintain vanished like smoke, and the price he had to pay was an embarrassment he could never undo. Still, Jackson couldn't give up. While David looked at him with unwavering eyes, the officer tried to maintain the appearance of controlling the situation. He couldn't accept that a black man was publicly challenging him. The crowd around them began to murmur, the onlookers clearly seeing the officer's discomfort, and criticisms rang out incessantly. One person in the crowd criticized him, saying, "The police have no right to do this to anyone." This only made Jackson more confused and powerless. But the more Jackson tried to maintain control, the more he lost it. The crowd grew larger, and the tension in the air began to spread. Derisive comments about the officer came from all directions, like slaps to his face. A man in the crowd pointed at Jackson and shouted, "Who do you think you are to bully someone like that? He's the governor, and you can't treat him like this." Those murmurs turned into loud shouts, making Jackson feel as though he had lost all the respect and authority he once had. In that moment, David didn't rush to react. He calmly walked closer to the officer, his steps strong and confident. David showed no hesitation in his gaze. Each step he took was a statement that he stood for justice and would not allow this injustice to continue. As he moved closer to Jackson, all eyes were on him. David stared straight at the officer, not with anger or fury, but with resolve and calmness. "You'll regret misjudging me," David said, each word sinking deeply into the officer's mind. His voice was not rushed and there was no trace of anger, but these words hit Jackson like a direct slap to his confidence, making him realize his mistake. David was not someone he could easily bully. He was the governor, holding power and justice in his hands. The officer felt his own surrender grow stronger, trying to hold on but sinking deeper into humiliation. The witnesses didn't need any further explanation. They had seen enough, and their gazes were filled with emotion and satisfaction, knowing that at last the injustice had been exposed. David didn't stop there. He continued to look at Jackson, pulling the governor's badge from his pocket and holding it up in front of the officer, making it impossible for him to avoid. "You need to apologize to me immediately," David demanded, his voice deep and persuasive. "Apologize publicly in front of everyone here for your wrongful actions." David's words were like an order, undeniable. He didn't need to yell or resist. This request wasn't just an apology for himself, but a redefinition of power in this society. Jackson stood still, not knowing what to do. He could still clearly feel the eyes of the crowd watching his every move, and with each passing second his pride and arrogance were being slowly eroded. What lay before him wasn't a police officer enforcing justice, but an abuser of power, and that realization made him feel ashamed. The officer might try to reassure himself that he still had control, but the cost of this arrogance was now painfully clear. David's public demand for an apology was an exposure of the flaws in the system, the things he and others had to face in an unjust society. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Then whispers began again, louder than before. The witnesses couldn't believe what they had just heard. This scene, where a governor was demanding a public apology from an officer, was no longer just a personal confrontation. It had become a powerful resistance against abuse of power and racism in society. The onlookers, even those who had never participated in these struggles, could feel that this was an important moment, a turning point for how they would begin to rethink power and justice in the society they lived in. Finally, Jackson had no choice but to face his mistakes. He lowered his head not out of fear, but because of a truth he couldn't escape. David's words, though not harsh, carried an undeniable strength. In that moment, Jackson realized that the injustice he had created wasn't just a wrong against an individual, but a wrong against society as a whole. He looked at David, his gaze no longer arrogant as before, but filled with regret and humiliation. The officer realized that he couldn't stand above justice, and he couldn't defeat the truth. As soon as the video capturing the entire incident between David Miles and Officer Haxon began circulating on social media, everything quickly spiraled out of control for both of them. Within hours, the video had garnered thousands of views, shares, and comments. People from all corners of the city, even from distant areas, found in it a story reflecting racial discrimination and police abuse of power. Fierce criticism of Jackson spread like wildfire on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Comments, along with hashtags such as Justice for David and Racism and Divorce, flooded the internet, turning the video into a global hot topic. The online community reacted strongly. Calls for justice and demands for immediate action to investigate the officer's behavior began pouring in from prominent civil rights organizations, groups advocating for black rights, and supporters of justice. They didn't just criticize Officer Jackson's actions, but viewed them as a glaring example of a system functioning in an unjust and discriminatory way. Organizations like Black Lives Matter quickly issued strong statements on the matter, asserting that this wasn't an isolated case, but a sign of a larger problem within the entire police force. One of the notable reactions came from Alana Matthews, a famous human rights activist who strongly condemned the incident as soon as the video went viral. The officer's behavior is not only an abuse of power, but also an outright affront to the human rights of every individual, she wrote in a Twitter post, which quickly attracted millions of shares. We cannot sit idly by while those in power continue to abuse justice in this way. It's time to take action. Such statements made the storm of criticism even stronger. The online community wasn't just limited to ordinary people. Celebrities and social media influencers also could not remain silent. Rihanna, LeBron James, and other stars began sharing the video and posts condemning Officer Jackson's actions. The celebrity community quickly seized the opportunity to speak out on the issue of racism in the police force, emphasizing that this event could not be ignored. LeBron James, known for his outspoken advocacy on social justice, wrote on his Twitter, "The police can change, but we need to act now. It's time for all of us to demand justice." The video, which was initially just a scene between David and Jackson, soon became a wave that spread rapidly across the media. News channels quickly reported on the incident, analyzing not only the officer's actions, but also what it revealed about a system that needed to change. Headlines like "Racist Cop Exposed in Front of the Crowd" and "Governor vs. Police, a Milestone for Justice" began appearing in the press. Everything was no longer limited to conversations on social media. It had become a central topic of discussion in communities and across the media. The debates didn't stop at criticizing the officer's actions. Big questions started to arise about the structure and system of the police force in general. Why does the police force continue to treat black people this way? Was a major question raised by many. The online community wasn't just opposing the actions of a single officer, they were calling for widespread reform across the entire police system. This had been an issue long ignored, but now, after this incident, it had become a societal issue. As the story spread, David Miles not only became the target in a confrontation with the police, but he also became a symbol of justice in the fight against racism. He received strong support from civil rights organizations, and influential figures worldwide also spoke out. The support came not just from the public, but from politicians as well. By this point, the debate was no longer confined to a single incident. Political leaders began to engage in discussions about the legal system and police power. Several high-ranking politicians called for immediate police reform to stop abuse of power and racial discrimination. From Washington, D.C., Senator Karen Lewis declared that it was time to end the police force's overreach. She called for the government to conduct a thorough investigation into this case, as well as other instances of police power abuse. With pressure from civil rights organizations and the involvement of politicians, the story began to gain the attention of the authorities, and calls for an investigation were made. David had stood up not just for himself, but for all those who had been oppressed. He became a role model for standing up against injustice and protecting human rights. The debate had transcended the David Jackson incident. It became a confrontation between justice and abuse of power, between the discriminated community and public authorities. And at the center of all this was a video, a story, and a governor who dared to stand up and demand demand that justice be served. The story was not just a confrontation between a citizen and an officer. It was part of a larger fight, a battle for the rights of the discriminated, for fairness and transparency in society. Thanks to the explosion on social media, this story successfully brought issues of racism in the police force to light, creating a powerful ripple effect and serving as a catalyst for real reform. Soon after the video of the confrontation between David Miles and Officer Jackson spread widely on social media, officials began conducting an official investigation into the officer's actions. The state government could not remain passive, and under pressure from the community, a thorough investigation was launched. Authorities, including the city police department and the governor's office, quickly took action to verify the accuracy of the information in the video and whether Jackson's actions violated police procedures. This investigation wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It had to clarify whether there was a widespread system of abuse of power and racism within the police force. The early days of the investigation were a series of tense meetings and exchanges of information between police leadership and government officials. However, no one could deny that the pressure from the community and social media had forced them to act. The investigation not only focused on Officer Jackson, but also expanded to similar cases within the entire police force. Witnesses to the incident began to step forward, and all available data, from the video to testimonies from those nearby, was collected. Laketer took his life in two. Meanwhile, within the police force, tension gradually escalated. Officers began facing pressure from both their colleagues and superiors. Some in the force were ashamed of Jackson's actions, unable to accept that someone in their ranks could behave so unjustly. However, others still sided with him, arguing that the officer's actions were just an isolated incident and did not reflect the entire police force. This created a division within the department, where those in power could not agree on how to handle the issue. Some officers began having private conversations about whether they could continue working in a system they no longer trusted. These discussions reflected not only the polarization within the police force, but also signaled a potential reform. As the investigation continued, videos documenting the incident kept being spread on media platforms. These videos didn't just include footage from the phones of those present at D80, but also analysis and commentary from civilians and civil rights organizations. One particular video gained attention when someone in the crowd captured the dialogue between Jackson and David, revealing more about the officer's misconduct. The video not only reflected the wrongdoings of one individual, but also highlighted the existence of a system in which racist behavior and abuse of power had become part of the police culture. Soon after, an unexpected twist emerged. During the investigation, another officer who had been present at the scene was found to have a history of racial discrimination. The earlier video not only captured Jackson's actions, but it also inadvertently recorded the actions and words of another officer, who was later discovered to have evidence of a past linked to racism. These revelations shook the entire police force and made the investigation even more serious. The history of this officer, including complaints from previous years about racist behavior, began to come to light. This not only raised further doubts about the integrity of the police force, but also made many in the community feel that racism within the police wasn't an isolated incident, but a widespread issue that needed to be addressed thoroughly. As the evidence of the officer's past was leaked, public opinion became explosive. Civil rights organizations and groups fighting for black rights grew even stronger in calling for comprehensive reform. The community began to criticize the police force for covering up misconduct in previous cases. Protests, critical tweets, and social media posts became even more vocal, putting immense pressure on the authorities. Eventually, a decision was made. Jackson and the other officer were both immediately suspended. However, this decision was only the first step. The investigations were expanded, no longer limited to the city, but reaching beyond the state, to other cities where similar incidents had occurred. Officers who might have acted inappropriately in the past would be investigated, and if evidence was found, they would face severe punishment. This marked an important step forward in addressing the issue. However, there were mixed opinions about whether suspending the officers would be enough to bring justice to the victims of racial discrimination. Some argued that stronger actions were needed, including reforming police training systems, increasing oversight, and enforcing stricter measures to prevent abuse of power. But regardless, the suspension was an important step, not only for David, but for the entire police system, sending a message that injustice would not be tolerated. The initial results of this investigation changed the way the community viewed the police force. This event was no longer just an isolated story. It had become a societal issue demanding strong and lasting change. The online community and civil rights organizations had won a major victory in the fight for justice and equality. However, the big question remained: would this investigation truly pave the way for larger changes within the entire police system? After Officer Jackson was suspended, the confrontation between David Miles and the police force evolved from a personal incident into a large movement that attracted the attention of millions across the country. The crowd, including protesters and civil rights organizations, organized a series of protests calling for police system reform. These protests didn't stop in major cities, but spread across states, with powerful slogans like "End Police Brutality" and "Justice for All." Each march, each gathering carried a clear message. The police system needed to change. The protests not only condemned the actions of one officer, but also expanded to address deeper issues within the force, particularly regarding racism and abuse of power. Despite the strong support for the protests from the community, society couldn't avoid deep divisions. Conservative groups began to strongly oppose the calls for police reform, arguing that such demands would weaken the power of the police force and could lead to chaos. The debates weren't just happening in the media. They spread into families, where discussions about power and justice became a central issue. Still, the voices of civil rights organizations and individuals like David began to bring a new energy to the struggle. This wasn't just one person's fight, but a societal fight, where the oppressed and racially discriminated began to demand their rights. David, despite being the governor of the state, could no longer stand on the sidelines of the struggle. The issue was no longer about handling one officer, but had become a revolution for justice. David realized that only deep reform within the police force could address this issue comprehensively. It wasn't just about holding individuals accountable, but changing the entire system that had allowed abuses of power to continue for years. After intense discussions and an increasing awareness of the need for change, David made the decision to lead a comprehensive police reform initiative. He was no longer just a politician, he had become a determined leader in the fight against racism and abuse of power. This decision was not easy for David. He faced immense pressure from those within the government and the police force. Many of his colleagues in politics strongly opposed it, arguing that changing the police system would undermine the discipline and protection provided by the force. However, David did not back down. He knew that the change he was calling for was necessary for a fair and equal society. He called for a revolution in the way police handled minority communities, proposing solutions for reforming police training systems, enhancing oversight, and enforcing reporting procedures for abuse of power. He also suggested creating independent bodies to oversee police activities, ensuring they couldn't act outside the law. With strong support from civil rights organizations and justice advocacy groups, David presented his reform agenda to both the government and the public. His proposals included changing police training methods, requiring officers to participate in courses on implicit bias and racism. Additionally, he called for increased oversight and transparency in police investigations, as well as expanding the rights of civil rights organizations and communities to monitor and respond to police conduct. One key aspect of the program was reforming the reporting process, allowing victims of abuse to speak out easily without fear of retaliation or being ignored. The reform agenda David put forward was not a temporary solution. It was a long-term strategy aimed at changing the entire police system from the inside out, ensuring that the rights of minority communities would be protected, and that no one would suffer from racism or abuse of power by those entrusted with upholding the law. As soon as the reform measures were made public, opposition from conservative forces in society began to grow. They argued that this change would dilute power and lead to a weakening of the community's protection. However, David remained undeterred. He continued to fight for the implementation of the program, asserting that justice could no longer be delayed due to personal interests or the defense of an outdated system. The criticism didn't discourage him. On the contrary, it strengthened his resolve and perseverance. Finally, after months of work, the reform programs began to show clear results. The police force was retrained with a stricter system of oversight and reporting of misconduct. Officers who did not comply with the reform process were held accountable. For minority communities, this reform opened a new path of hope as they felt they could trust the police and the justice system. The change didn't stop within the police force. It spread throughout society. David was no longer just the governor. He had become a symbol of perseverance and justice. He had proven that anyone, no matter their position, could bring about significant change if they dared to face challenges and stand up for what was right. These advancements not only brought change in how the police acted, but also shifted societal perceptions about rights and equality for everyone, regardless of race or social standing. After months of tension and relentless struggle, David Miles and the civil rights organizations began to see significant results from the police reform he had called for. The measures to retrain police on implicit bias, racism, and human rights were implemented on a wide scale. Reporting processes became more transparent, and now victims of abuse could easily file complaints without fear of retaliation. The changes in the police force's operations were not just empty promises, but strong, practical steps, demonstrated by improvements in how police interacted with the community, especially with minority groups. Investigations also began to follow a more public and transparent process, with independent agencies involved in overseeing police activity. However, as the positive results gradually became evident, not everyone agreed with these changes. While most of the community, particularly civil rights groups, believed in the reforms and saw them as a significant step toward addressing racism and abuse of power within the police force, there were still groups that opposed them fiercely. These groups included some police officers, conservative politicians, and citizens who felt that the reforms weakened the police's ability to protect the community. They argued that excessive reform would make the police weak and harder to control, while also putting them in a difficult position when facing increasingly dangerous criminals. These objections didn't just remain within political discussions or social media debates, but also spread to protests, where some people expressed their dissatisfaction with what they saw as overly aggressive reforms. They felt that while the police were being asked to change their ways, criminal groups were not facing strong enough measures to counter them. This sense of insecurity within the community made them doubt the effectiveness of the measures the government had put in place. This created a conflict between two opposing viewpoints within the community, one supporting reform and equality, while the other feared that change would undermine public safety. Debates on social media platforms, political meetings, and even family discussions centered around this issue. Those opposed to police reform argued that David Miles and his supporters had lost balance by focusing only on the rights of minority groups, without acknowledging the necessity of maintaining order in society. The tension was further amplified as David and civil rights organizations relentlessly pushed the government to continue and expand the reforms. David understood that this change was necessary, but he also recognized that in order to achieve a fair and equal society, he would have to keep fighting against the pressures from conservative forces in society. He couldn't allow this opposition to halt the crucial progress that the reform had made. However, in the months that followed, the community began to realize that this change was not a passing storm, but a long-term process that required patience and understanding. The community had to gradually get used to a new approach to justice, where justice wasn't just shown through punishment, but through listening and understanding the struggles faced by racially discriminated communities. David continued to call for unity within the community, affirming that police reform was not a threat to public safety but a step forward in creating a truly just system. Ultimately, despite fierce opposition, the changes that David and civil rights organizations had pushed for brought about positive results. The police force, although facing challenges in implementing the reforms, had become more transparent and more equitable in its approach to the community. Those who had previously experienced racial discrimination in police encounters felt they were no longer ignored or treated unfairly. This didn't mean that all problems had been solved completely, but it certainly marked a strong first step in improving a system that had existed with injustices for many decades. The situation might not have been perfect, and there were still those who disagreed with the reforms, but David believed that the change would continue to unfold, and one day, true justice would be served for everyone. After the reform began to show initial positive results, David Miles realized that in order for the change to be truly sustainable, preventive measures were needed to stop racial discrimination from recurring. He understood that reform was only the first step, and without an effective oversight and prevention mechanism, discriminatory behaviors would never fully disappear. David decided that not only did the police need to change how they acted, but an independent monitoring system had to be created to ensure that similar violations would not happen again. He called for the establishment of independent oversight agencies to monitor all police actions, from traffic stops to arrests, with the goal of protecting the rights of innocent people, especially minority communities. This was not just about monitoring police behavior, but also about fostering accountability in every decision they made. These measures would include enhanced psychological training for officers to help them recognize their own biases and how to control their emotions while performing their duties. Officers would be required to take courses on emotional management, unconscious bias, and how to handle tense situations without causing harm. In this way, David aimed not just to change individuals, but to build a new culture within the police force. In implementing these measures, David also pushed for the public release of reports on police behavior, ensuring that the community could track and provide feedback on the actions of law enforcement. He demanded that these reports be transparent, open, and not hidden, while also calling on the media to engage in monitoring and providing analysis of police incidents. For David, this not only created an environment of transparency, but also helped restore public trust in the justice system. As a result, the reforms began to show clear effects. Officers were now trained to understand and manage their own unconscious biases, leading to fairer interactions with the community. Instances of abuse of power and racism noticeably decreased. David noticed that not only minority communities but society as a whole had begun to rebuild trust with the police force. Interactions between police and citizens became easier, and many no longer felt like targets of racial discrimination. The first step had succeeded, but David knew the work was far from complete. However, these changes had created a solid foundation for the long-term development of a fair and equal society. Communities began to see police not just as those with power, but as those responsible for protecting everyone, regardless of race, gender, or origin. As time went by, things got more and more. Roosevelt's image as lawyer and protector for the public, those who had once suffered from abuse of power now felt they could trust the police force. And David knew this change wouldn't stop with one group. It would affect society as a whole. As the reforms within the police force began to show results, the community and civil rights organizations continued to intensify their fight to protect the rights of those discriminated against. Organizations such as Black Lives Matter and civil rights groups kept calling for changes in police policies, especially ensuring that the rights and dignity of people of color would no longer be harmed. Protest continued, though not as tense as before, and they still carried the strength of emphasizing that justice must be fully implemented and not ignored. Minority communities began to feel that, after a long period of silence, their voices were finally being heard, and they were no longer standing alone in this fight. However, this change was not without its challenges. While the reforms brought positive results, opposition from conservative groups in society remained strong. Political parties quickly realized that the issue of police reform had become a sensitive and important topic for voters. They began to use this issue as part of their campaign strategies, not only at the state level, but also nationally. Some politicians stood up to support the reform, seeing it as an important achievement in building a fairer society. But many others opposed it, arguing that the reforms would weaken the police force and threaten public safety. David Miles, though the first to lead the reform, was not immune to pressure from opposing political parties. These critics argued that the reforms were too strong and would leave the police force weak and unable to protect citizens from crime. Some politicians did not hesitate to use this issue to attack one another during campaigns, trying to call for neutrality or even strongly opposing the changes. These political confrontations weren't just occurring in meetings, but were spreading to public debates on media platforms. Opposing parties used the situation to gain an advantage in the upcoming elections, creating a tense political atmosphere. David and his supporters knew they could not stop in the face of these criticisms. To maintain the changes, they had to continue fighting not only against conservative forces, but also against politicians who were exploiting the issue for personal gain. David affirmed that change was necessary and there could be no return to the days of police abuse and racial discrimination. But he also understood that each step he took would be met with resistance from those who did not want change. Therefore, he continued to lead the reform, aiming not only to create a fair police force, but also to build a political model where justice is enforced without discrimination. While political parties continued to debate and use the issue of police reform to serve their campaigns, civil rights communities and justice advocates kept calling for sustainable change. Protests and community meetings continued, with each struggle not just a fight for specific change, but a fight for a fairer society. They knew that reform wasn't easy, but without it, all the efforts of the past years would be in vain. David's efforts for change began to receive support from civil rights organizations and those affected by racial discrimination. But this journey was still long, and the political attacks would not stop until real change was achieved to meet society's expectations. In the face of harsh opposition from political parties and conservative forces, David Miles kept searching for solutions to maintain the reform process. After a series of tense discussions and increasing pressure from all sides, David realized that the police reform could not stop at surface-level changes. To maintain and protect the achievements the community had made, he decided to propose a major strategy aimed at comprehensively changing the laws of justice. This strategy was not just about improving the police force, but also about rebuilding the justice system from the ground up, including regulations, laws, and how power is exercised in society. This strategy aimed not only at police reform, but also included measures to enforce citizens' rights and protect oppressed groups, especially minority communities. David proposed a new set of legal guidelines where abuse of power and racial discrimination would be dealt with more harshly. He called for the participation of all sectors of society, from civil rights organizations to community groups, lawmakers, and prominent figures in society. This not only created legal reform, but also opened the opportunity for all individuals, regardless of their status, to take part in building a fairer justice system. The key to David's success was the involvement of society as a whole. He knew that without consensus and participation from different social classes, these changes would only be empty promises. Therefore, David collaborated with civil rights organizations, legal experts, and those affected by racial discrimination to create a comprehensive reform plan, not just limited to policing, but also covering issues like fair education, job opportunities, and rights in the legal system. He called for everyone to come together to build a system in which there would be no discrimination or abuse of power, and every citizen, regardless of race or background, could trust in justice. When the strategy was introduced, despite continued opposition from conservative groups, David received strong support from civil rights communities, social organizations, and influential figures in society. Progressive politicians also stood by him, affirming that the reform was necessary and would help create a fairer society, one where human rights were fully protected. This marked a turning point in the fight for justice, as all sides realized that change could not wait any longer. Ultimately, the result of this strategy was a new political and police system built on the principles of fairness, transparency, and accountability. The police force was retrained to better understand human rights and how to work with minority communities without imposing biases or abusing power. Oversight measures, with the participation of civil rights organizations and independent agencies, ensured that all police actions were closely monitored and made public. Investigations into abuse of power and racial discrimination became more transparent, and the public had easy access to information about these cases. Not only the police force, but the entire political system underwent a major change. Policies related to education, healthcare, and job opportunities for minority communities were reformed, helping bridge the gap between social classes. Job opportunities for people of color expanded, and measures to reduce social inequality were strongly implemented. Although many challenges remained, David and his allies had laid the foundation for a fairer society, one where racism had no place. As a result, a new system emerged where everyone, regardless of race or gender, could live in a just society. The police were no longer a tool of abuse but became guardians of justice, respecting the rights of every individual. Minority communities began to feel safe and trust the police force, no longer fearing discrimination or unjust treatment. While this process was neither easy nor swift, this change brought great hope to all those who had fought for it over the years. After Officer Jackson was suspended, the investigation into his actions didn't remain a personal matter. Authorities began a comprehensive investigation aimed at uncovering not only Jackson's misconduct, but also the actions of other officers within the force. The investigation wasn't limited to one locality, but expanded to various police departments with the goal of determining whether similar abuses of power and racial discrimination existed within the industry. The government wanted to ensure that this incident wasn't an isolated case, but rather a sign of a larger problem within the police force. This investigation aimed not only to protect the community's rights, but also to uncover whether there was a system that protected or enabled misconduct within the police force. As the investigation became public, it wasn't just Officer Jackson who felt concerned. The internal dynamics within the police force also started to become tense. Officers, especially those with many years of service, began facing pressure from both the public and their colleagues. Some officers expressed unease, fearing that the investigation could delve too deeply and expose past wrongdoings they or their colleagues had committed. Others worried that excessive transparency in the investigation would tarnish the entire police force's reputation, causing a loss of trust from the community. Meanwhile, some officers felt embarrassed as instances of abuse of power were brought to light. They began to feel they could no longer stand firm in an environment where fairness and transparency were being demanded so rigorously. This created internal conflict within the police force. Those accustomed to the old ways, where power and protection from colleagues could shield them from consequences, were now facing a system they could no longer control. Meetings in the police leadership rooms, where discussions about the investigation took place, became more tense than ever. Some leaders felt cornered, caught between two opposing forces, defending their colleagues and maintaining fairness within the department. They understood that if they couldn't control this investigation, it wouldn't just affect the officers involved, but the entire police apparatus would suffer severely. Other officers, especially those who had engaged in misconduct in the past, felt tremendous pressure as their silence was broken. They realized they could be investigated and face serious consequences. Some began to justify their actions, claiming they were just doing their jobs, that law enforcement sometimes required firmness, and that these actions were merely part of the process. But these justifications failed to convince the public and only deepened the divisions within the police force. Remaining officers, those with a sense of professionalism and responsibility, saw that unless they faced the truth and were willing to change, the police force would never regain the trust of the community. The consequences of this investigation not only affected Officer Jackson, but also led many other officers to reassess themselves and the work they were doing. Some began suggesting reforms within the police force, acknowledging that certain instances of abuse of power had not been properly addressed in the past. This showed that, despite resistance and dissatisfaction, the investigation had sparked an awakening within the police force, especially as honest officers began to see that only comprehensive change and reform could help restore public trust. The big question now was whether the investigation would truly lead to profound changes in how the police force operated, or if it would merely be a purge of individuals without addressing the root causes. The reactions within the police force indicated that change would not be easy and would face significant challenges. However, regardless of the outcome of the investigation, at least it had initiated a process of internal cleaning, paving the way for more extensive reforms in the future. The investigation into Officer Jackson's behavior didn't stop there. As investigators continued to gather data from previous incidents, a confidential document from an old investigation was unexpectedly leaked. This document revealed shocking information about several officers in the force, with evidence of a history of abuse of power and racism in their work. These documents not only implied that such behavior had been ongoing for years, but also pointed to the fact that previous cases had been covered up and not properly addressed. These officers had extensive records of violations, but instead of being investigated and held accountable, they were protected or even promoted. The leak of this document triggered a major crisis within the police force, shaking public trust and tarnishing the reputation of the entire police force in the eyes of the community. This crisis worsened as prominent figures in the police, once considered role models, quickly became criminals in the eyes of the public. The information about these violations immediately attracted strong attention from civil rights groups, who continued to call for reforms and demanded severe punishment for the officers involved. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and civil rights protection groups intensified their criticism of these actions, urging the government to take serious action against the implicated officers. These organizations didn't just call for an investigation, but also pushed for reform campaigns within the police force to ensure that such violations would never happen again. The wave of outrage within the community grew stronger as high-profile figures within the police force were brought to light. Some officers were found to have ties to racist groups or had engaged in racist behavior in their work. This further divided the police force internally, as some officers sided with the accused while others spoke out against the wrongdoing within the industry. In response to this situation, many police leaders spoke out, calling for extensive reform to remove officers who were unfit for duty and to change how the force operated. Some officers were temporarily suspended to facilitate the investigation, while others continued to be investigated for past misconduct. With increasing pressure from the community, the government could no longer ignore the situation. Calls for reform grew louder, and eventually political leaders had to step in. The government announced that it would implement a comprehensive reform in the police force, with changes in training procedures, the reform of oversight mechanisms, and increased transparency in investigations related to police conduct. Civil rights groups demanded that the authorities conduct a further investigation, not only to address past violations, but also to prevent similar behaviors in the future. The crowd, though still feeling disappointed, began to feel hopeful as they saw concrete measures being implemented. This event didn't stop at just Jackson's case. The expanded investigation led to a series of other cases that had been ignored or covered up for years. Despite opposition from conservative forces in society, these changes made justice advocates feel that their fight was not in vain. These reforms were not merely about addressing one wrongdoing, but a significant step toward rebuilding public trust in the police force, and, more importantly, ensuring that justice was administered more equally and fairly for everyone. The result of the investigation was a significant change in how the police force operated. David not only introduced reform measures, but also demanded independent oversight of police behavior, ensuring that transparency and fairness would be maintained. Officers who failed to comply would face severe punishment. Specifically, the public release of investigation reports would allow the community to track and provide feedback on police actions, helping them no longer feel ignored or oppressed by an unjust system. After the expanded investigation into police misconduct and the changes in police operations were made public, the state government began implementing strong measures to change police behavior. These measures didn't just stop at reforms within the police force, but also extended to creating new laws about police power and justice. The government introduced strict policies to ensure that the police force adhered to operational procedures and that the rights of citizens, particularly minority communities, would not be violated. Draft laws were created to enhance independent oversight, requiring the police to operate in a transparent environment and be held accountable for their actions. This was not only aimed at protecting justice, but also at rebuilding public trust in law enforcement. However, as these measures were introduced, political opposition began to rise sharply. Political parties continued to debate how the reforms should be implemented and the necessary changes within the police force. Strong reform advocates argued that this was an opportunity to rebuild justice and eliminate abuse of power within the police system. They asserted that reform was necessary to create a safe, fair, and equal environment for all. For them, these changes would not only promote justice but also help the police become true law enforcement officers, serving the community rather than continuing to oppress and discriminate. However, a large portion of politicians and conservatives in society were concerned that these measures would weaken the power of the police and hinder their ability to effectively maintain public order. They argued that if the police force no longer had the power and freedom to act as before, they wouldn't be able to prevent criminal actions and ensure community safety. Some believed that these changes could lead to a loss of control, with police unable to enforce their power decisively and effectively. Opponents of the reform claimed that limiting police power was a threat to national security and could lead to chaos in society. As the debate became intense, some politicians sought to bring this issue into their election campaigns, making police reform one of the hot topics in the election. Reform supporters faced challenges not only from conservative politicians, but also from groups with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, groups that felt that changing the system would threaten their benefits. This created a major division in society, with one side believing reform was inevitable, while the other saw it as a weakening of power and justice. Despite the opposition, David and the reform supporters did not back down. David continued to assert that in a fair society, justice must be implemented transparently and without discrimination. He affirmed that, while these changes may make things difficult for the police in the short term, they were necessary to rebuild public trust and end discrimination in society. According to David, the police system needed to be reformed to meet the demands of a just and equal society, where everyone had equal rights, regardless of race, background, or religion. These political debates not only highlighted the divisions in society, but also increased tensions within the community. However, it was from this very debate that the reform advocates found new strength in unity. Civil rights groups continued to push forward with their campaigns, relentlessly demanding that the government implement reform. These pressures helped David not only hold his ground in the political battle, but also strengthened his resolve to implement justice for everyone. As the debate over police reform escalated, a large protest against police actions and demanding police system reform took place in downtown. The community, especially civil rights groups and those affected by racial discrimination, could no longer wait and decided to speak out strongly. Protesters flooded the streets, carrying signs demanding police reform and the strict punishment of abuse of power. The massive crowd reflected not only anger and frustration with the police, but also symbolized a movement for equal rights for all citizens, especially oppressed groups. The entire city erupted as demands for justice were clearly and powerfully expressed. Fueled by the protests, the campaign for reform gained strong support from civil rights organizations and prominent individuals in society. However, surprisingly, some politicians who had previously supported protecting the police began to stand up in favor of reform demands. These voices represented a significant shift, as they had previously opposed changes, arguing that reforms could weaken societal stability. However, under the relentless pressure from the community and the growing strength of the movement, these politicians eventually recognized that reforms were necessary to maintain public trust in the police force and fairness in society. Their statements began to influence public opinion, altering the political landscape. Despite lingering doubts about the extent of the reform's impact, officials gradually accepted that reform was not a threat, but a necessary measure to build a fairer society. With this support, David Miles continued to push for discussions on a police reform bill. After several tense meetings and political negotiations, the bill was finally passed. This law calls for enhanced oversight of police conduct, not just in routine interactions, but also during arrests and the use of force. One of the key points of the law is the creation of an independent mechanism to investigate police misconduct, ensuring that all wrongdoing will be dealt with fairly and not covered up. These agencies will operate independently, free from external influences, and have the authority to investigate and prosecute violating officers. The law also requires police forces to be transparent with information regarding cases of misconduct while encouraging community involvement in oversight and feedback. These changes are not only steps forward in reform but also a victory for justice in society. The new law, despite opposition from some conservative groups, marked a major shift in how the police force operates. The implemented oversight measures have helped strengthen accountability and transparency, while the independent mechanism allows victims of abuse to seek justice without fear of retaliation. Although the process is not easy and many challenges remain, this is a significant step in creating a police system where justice is truly upheld. Thanks to the support of politicians, civil rights organizations, and the community, David helped drive a powerful movement aimed at building a fairer society. These actions not only ensured that abuse of power would be stopped, but also helped create a justice system that every citizen could trust and rely on. As a result, the reforms within the police force are gradually becoming a reality, changing not only how the police operate, but also how society views justice and human rights. After the reforms in the police force began to be implemented, David Miles realized that for these changes to have a lasting impact, a strategy for educating the community about the rights and responsibilities of the police was essential. He called for a series of workshops to be held across cities to raise public awareness about the role of the police, the rights that citizens are entitled to, and the responsibilities of the police in ensuring fair law enforcement. These workshops attracted legal experts, social activists, and community members, particularly those who had been victims of abuse of power. The workshops became an opportunity for people to share experiences, listen to experts, and engage in dialogue on how to improve the relationship between the police and the community. Legal experts presented detailed information about the basic rights of citizens when interacting with the police, from the right to request identification to the right not to be racially discriminated against during police encounters. Social activists also shared real-life stories from racially marginalized communities, offering valuable lessons on how to control abuse of power and respond when police overstep their authority. These workshops aimed to create transparency and accountability in how the police communicate and act with citizens, rebuilding trust in the community and reducing the injustices faced by many minority groups. However, the introduction of these workshops was not easily accepted by everyone. Some conservative forces in society who maintained the view of protecting the police's absolute power strongly opposed these workshops. They argued that educating the public about the police's authority would weaken the image and credibility of law enforcement, making it difficult for them to effectively enforce the law. They contended that excessive transparency and too much training on police authority would make the force weaker, less decisive when facing tense and dangerous situations, such as when confronting violent criminals. Additionally, these opponents argued that excessive criticism of the police would increase skepticism and distrust in society toward law enforcement. They feared that if people began to question the authority of the police, society would no longer be safe, and the police would be unable to fulfill their duty to protect citizens from harm. Intense debates on this issue took place not only in political meetings but also in families, at dinner tables, where family members began arguing about whether the police were fulfilling their role properly. Meanwhile, reform advocates argued that a police system without accountability and oversight could no longer be sustained. They stated that introducing educational programs about police power was necessary so that every citizen, especially minority communities, could better understand their rights and how to respond when faced with abuse of power. They believed that a transparent and fair police system would create a safer environment for everyone, not just those in power. These advocates continued to call for changes in police training to help officers become more aware of implicit biases and how to work effectively without violating citizens' rights. Despite strong opposition from some parts of society, David and his allies did not abandon these educational workshops. They knew that without implementing these educational measures, the reforms would remain theoretical and not truly change how the police force operated. The workshops continued to be held across cities, with participation from experts, citizens affected by racial discrimination, and justice advocates. Over time, these discussions gained more attention and community involvement, and David realized that, although the path to change was long, this was the only way to build a fairer society. In one of the key workshops on police reform, David Miles decided to participate directly, not only as the state governor, but also as the leader of the revolution in how society perceives power and justice. In his speech, he not only focused on specific reforms within the police force, but also expanded the discussion to a broader theme, changing the way power is taught in both politics and society. David emphasized that to build a fair and equal society, not only the police, but every citizen must understand their power and how to use it responsibly and reasonably. He pointed out that, even from a young age, students should be educated about power and justice, and these values must be reinforced across all levels of society. He went on to discuss training not only within the police, but in all sectors of society, from politics to education, about justice and individual rights. We cannot change one part of society without changing the entire system, David said, highlighting the close connection between political power, executive authority, and education. For justice to truly exist, society must understand the power it holds and how to use that power without infringing on the rights of others. Throughout his speech, he emphasized that power should not be a tool for oppression, but a responsibility, and that every individual in society, from those in power to ordinary citizens, must be educated on how to use that power justly and appropriately. David's participation in this workshop not only enhanced the credibility of the reforms, but also made many realize that the issue was not just about changes within the police force, but also about changing societal perceptions of power. The discussions following David's speech became more lively as legal experts and social activists joined debates on how to educate citizens about justice and individual rights. Questions about power, justice, and civic responsibility were raised, which not only deepened the discussion, but also initiated a shift in how the community views the justice system and power. Ultimately, these workshops became the foundation for a significant change in the community's perception of justice and power. The active participation of civil rights groups, social organizations, and influential figures in politics made these workshops an essential part of the social reform process. The community began to have a clearer understanding of their rights, and these changes in societal awareness began to impact specific actions within the community. As a result, discussions were no longer limited to political organizations or government agencies, but became a shared issue for society as a whole. These workshops continued to be rolled out nationwide, not only in large cities, but also expanding into smaller areas, where people had less access to information about reforms. Each workshop, each dialogue was a step forward in building a fairer society, where power was no longer a tool of oppression but a responsibility to protect justice for all. The outcomes of these workshops not only helped David Miles strengthen his resolve in the reform effort, but also created a powerful force supporting justice and human rights. The public no longer saw justice and power as distant concepts, but as living, tangible values reflected in every action they took. These workshops helped raise awareness about power while creating a new social class, one where justice is valued and executed transparently. After a long period of struggle, and with the reforms beginning to show signs of success, David Miles realized that the next crucial step in the process was reconciliation between community groups and the police force. While the reform measures had been implemented and yielded positive results, to build a truly fair society, he needed to focus on rebuilding trust between racially marginalized communities and the police. David understood that reform could not succeed without harmony and respect between law enforcement and the people they serve. He decided to embark on a reconciliation strategy, not only to ease tensions, but also to create a peaceful community environment where everyone felt protected and respected, regardless of race or background. David organized a series of meetings, direct dialogues between the police force and community groups. The goal of these dialogues was to create an open space where both the police and the community could share their feelings, thoughts, and concerns. These meetings were not debates or criticisms, but sincere conversation where both sides could understand each other better and begin to build relationships based on respect and understanding. Each meeting was a small but important step in rebuilding trust between the two parties, especially as participants from both sides acknowledged that change could not happen without cooperation from both. However, while these dialogues had brought some positive results, conflicts within the community could not be completely resolved. Civil rights groups continued to strongly criticize racist behavior in the police force, particularly in interactions with minority communities. Their protests and calls for action persisted, demanding that wrongdoing be dealt with harshly and that the oversight system be strengthened to ensure that every officer is held accountable for their actions. Despite the reforms that had been implemented, these groups still felt that the changes were happening too slowly and were not strong enough to truly end racism in the police force. Additionally, some people within the community felt that the reforms were progressing too slowly and did not meet expectations. They expressed frustration at seeing that past abuses of power by the police had not been fully addressed. The community began to feel as though the reform promises were empty words, and the lack of transparency in the reform process only heightened doubts about the sincerity of the government. Some people in the community, especially those who had directly experienced racism, felt that they still had not received the protection and justice they rightfully deserved. They could not accept that officers who had engaged in discriminatory behavior were still allowed to work in the force without facing appropriate consequences. Despite this, David did not give up. He realized that reconciliation was not an easy process and could not simply stop at dialogues between the community and the police. He continued to call for the involvement of every individual in society, from influencers to ordinary citizens, to work together to build a fairer society. He understood that change could not come easily, but only when both the police community and the marginalized communities worked together, discussed, and understood each other more could trust be restored. David was determined that every action would be carried out transparently and fairly, and the reforms would not just remain theoretical but must be demonstrated through concrete, powerful actions. As the battle continued, David and his allies remained persistent, aiming to create a peaceful and fair environment where everyone could live without fear of discrimination. This reconciliation, although many challenges remained ahead, would be an important first step in building a society where everyone, regardless of race, could live and work within a truly just system. After many months of struggle and continuous reforms being applied, a significant change began to take place within the police force when an African-American officer, once a victim of discrimination in the past, decided to lead a new initiative. Officer Marcus Johnson, who had endured racial discrimination throughout his career, especially in instances where he was treated unfairly by colleagues and superiors, realized that simply changing the way the police operated was not enough. He felt the need to take action to improve the relationship between the police force and the community, particularly the minority community, where mistrust and suspicion of the police were still high. Having witnessed the lack of understanding between the police and the people they were meant to protect, he understood that only deep reconciliation, with participation from both sides, could create lasting change. With motivation drawn from his own experiences, Marcus began organizing meetings between the police and the community. These meetings were not just simple dialogues, but an effort to create a new cooperative model, where both the police and the community participated in the development and reform process. Marcus not only called on police officers to confront the racism within the force, but also sought to serve as a bridge between both sides, helping both the community and the police to understand each other better. He introduced initiatives on emotional training, managing tense situations, and acknowledging past injustices to help police officers become more aware of their own implicit biases and how to handle difficult situations without causing harm to the community. The initiative quickly gained support from civil rights organizations who had been waiting for such a change for many years. They recognized that creating a peaceful environment between the police and the community was key to rebuilding trust and minimizing conflict. Other officers, especially younger ones, began to join this initiative, taking part in training sessions and dialogues not only to learn how to understand the community, but also to grasp the importance of listening to and empathizing with the issues the community was facing. Marcus became not just the organizer, but a living proof that by facing the past and acknowledging mistakes, both the police force and the community could rebuild their relationship, leading to a safer and more equitable community. The result of this initiative was the creation of a new cooperative model between the police and the community. Instead of the previously adversarial relationship, both sides began working together to find solutions to societal issues. This model not only helped the police better understand the difficulties the community faced, but also made the community feel that they could trust the police and the legal system. The initiative continued to expand, with police teams and community representatives meeting regularly to discuss security, justice, and the rights of the people. Each meeting became an opportunity to share experiences and find common solutions to the issues both sides encountered. This change not only had a profound impact on the police force, but also strongly influenced the community. As the police and the community began to engage in open dialogue, the conflicts that had existed before were gradually resolved, and trust between the two sides was rebuilt. This model slowly became a role model for other cities as they began to realize that true reconciliation is not just about formal meetings, but a continuous process of building mutual understanding and shared responsibility. The relationship between the police and the community was no longer a battle, but a collaboration toward a common goal, creating a safe and just society for all. After a long period of struggle and initial changes within the police force, leaders in government and the community began to realize that change cannot come solely from police reform. To create a fair and equal society, they must view the issue from a broader perspective, not just adjusting police behavior, but also changing the political and social structure. Issues of power, justice, and citizens' rights need to be addressed systematically across the entire system, from government operations to law enforcement at the local level. Therefore, reforms can not only focus on the police force, but must expand to social policies and fairness in the political system, ensuring that marginalized and oppressed groups are protected not only in their interactions with the police, but in all other areas of life as well. David Miles and his supporters of reform began to realize that social reform must go hand in hand with political reform. He and his colleagues not only pushed for initiatives regarding police power, but also called for structural changes in education, healthcare, and employment policies, particularly in ensuring the rights of minority communities. Social issues, such as inequality, discrimination in education and healthcare, must be addressed simultaneously with police reform to create a truly just society. Without political structural change, reforms to the police force may end up being mere formalities and not lead to long-term change. However, as politicians began to recognize the necessity of making deep changes across the system, they also faced strong pressure from voters. Supporters of police reform, particularly from civil rights groups and social organizations, began demanding that the government maintain the reform programs and not back down in the face of opposition from conservative groups. They insisted that these changes must not just be promises, but should be demonstrated through concrete actions. In the complex political environment, some politicians felt concerned about maintaining the power of the police force while facing these significant changes. They feared that implementing such drastic reforms could lead to the collapse of the security system and allow criminal activities to rise. Additionally, opposition from conservative groups only heightened political polarization. These individuals acknowledged that while police reform is necessary, they feared that too much change too quickly would weaken the power of the police and leave communities unprotected. They also criticized civil rights groups for exploiting the situation to impose unrealistic changes that would disrupt social order. David and his supporters understood that to move forward, they would have to confront this strong opposition and prove that change is not only necessary, but the only way to build a fairer society. As politicians debated how to implement reforms and maintain power, David and his allies continued to maintain the view that reform could not stop at small changes. He was adamant that these measures must be comprehensive, from reforming the police to overhauling social policies that promote fairness and equality in the community. David's persistence sparked a wave of change, not only within the police force, but throughout the political system, showing that, despite strong opposition, these changes were necessary to build a solid foundation of justice for all. As the debate over police reform and the power of public institutions reached its peak, an important meeting was held between civil rights leaders and government officials. This was a pivotal meeting, attended by influential individuals from all walks of life, from social activists to senior politicians. The main goal of the meeting was to find a common solution to the ongoing issues of police misconduct and racial discrimination in public institutions. This meeting was not just a discussion, but an opportunity for all parties, despite differing viewpoints, to come together and propose practical and specific reform suggestions. During the meeting, civil rights leaders strongly demanded that reform not only take place within the police, but extend to other public sectors in order to create a fair and equal environment for all. They emphasized that reform could not stop at minor adjustments but must be a comprehensive overhaul to ensure that all citizens, regardless of race, are treated equally and fairly. Specifically, they called for an independent oversight system for public institutions, especially the police, to ensure that acts of racial discrimination would not be tolerated or overlooked. Meanwhile, government officials, while acknowledging the serious issues within the system, could not avoid the political pressure from conservative groups. However, as public opinion continued to push for reform, they understood that change was inevitable. Government officials also recognized that to restore public trust, clear and transparent political adjustments were necessary to ensure that past mistakes would not be repeated. After hours of discussion and debate, the meeting reached a crucial decision to propose a series of reform measures that would clarify how power is exercised in public institutions. The result of this meeting was a series of political decisions and reforms, including specific measures to reduce racial discrimination in public institutions, particularly within the police force. These reforms include strengthening independent oversight, implementing special training programs for police officers and public servants on human rights, unconscious bias, and behavior management. One of the key outcomes was the establishment of independent oversight bodies to investigate and address police misconduct, ensuring that any abuse of power would be handled fairly and transparently. These decisions helped reduce racial discrimination in public institutions, opening a new chapter for society where all citizens feel safe and protected by the law, without the fear of discrimination or oppression. These political decisions not only changed the way the police force operated, but also contributed to the creation of a fair and transparent justice system. The community felt the transparency in the reform process, as unresolved issues were confronted and addressed seriously. These reforms also helped create an environment where the rights of all citizens are respected, and racial discrimination in public institutions can no longer exist without being addressed. Through these advances, David Miles and his supporters demonstrated that real change is possible when the community and political leaders collaborate to implement justice for all. The story of police reform and societal changes not only shook the government institutions, but also quickly spread across social media platforms. Videos, articles, and online discussions about police power and social equality attracted the attention of millions of people across the country and around the world. Issues related to racial discrimination within the police force were no longer the concern of just one community or group of people, but became a societal issue, reflected clearly in online discussions. Social media became a powerful platform where civil rights organizations, justice advocates, and individuals affected by racial discrimination could voice their opinions, call for change, and exert significant pressure on government agencies. However, as positive messages about change spread, conflicts within the online community also began to emerge. Some extremist groups and those opposed to the reforms started to fiercely oppose, claiming that the police reform measures posed a significant threat to society's power and security. Tense debates became frequent on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, where opposing views were strongly expressed. Some argued that the reform was unrealistic, stating that police would not be able to effectively protect the community if bound too much by regulations and strict oversight processes. These conservative groups called on the government to maintain the power of the police and warned of security collapse if reforms were implemented too forcefully. Additionally, in the online debates, racist rhetoric was prevalent. Opponents of the reform sought to justify discriminatory practices within the police force, offering arguments like justice must be strong and decisive, or we must take strong measures to deal with crime. These views reinforced the belief that police could abuse power without close supervision, leading to a deep polarization within the online community. Reform advocates continuously clashed with these conservative viewpoints, leading to relentless online spats. Hashtags like Justice for All and Police Reform gained strong traction, but there were also negative responses from those opposed to the reforms, resulting in long, unresolved debates. Nevertheless, these debates were not just meaningless criticisms, but actually played an important role in pushing for change. Civil rights organizations began leveraging the power of social media to amplify their campaigns, creating a strong wave of reaction not only on online platforms, but also in real-life protests. This intense online interaction created a ripple effect where individuals and communities could join the discussion, share their stories, and apply pressure on the government and authorities to ensure that reforms would be implemented thoroughly and seriously. Despite continued opposition from conservative groups, social media proved to be not only a tool for spreading information, but also an important platform that connected reform supporters, boosted large campaigns, and created a strong sense of unity among communities fighting for justice. These heated debates played a significant role in highlighting issues of racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. Furthermore, social media became a key driver for change, transforming the story of police reform from just a political struggle into a fight for justice that society as a whole must engage in. As the police reform issue gained momentum in society, a major social media campaign was organized by reform advocates. They decided not only to rely on real-life protests, but also to harness the power of social media to call for widespread public participation. Civil rights groups, organizations defending citizens' rights, and justice advocates used platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to spread messages about police reform and human rights. This campaign didn't just involve posting videos or information. It used online discussions to raise awareness and rally like-minded individuals to join the fight. Hashtags like Justice Now and Police Reform quickly became trending keywords, attracting millions of shares and comments. Each post, each video shared, carried a powerful message, calling for action and rejecting injustice within the police force. The campaign rapidly gained the participation of millions around the world, from ordinary citizens to celebrities in fields like sports, music, and film. Influential figures began sharing the reform message, creating a strong wave not only in the U.S., but also in other countries where issues of police power and racial discrimination were also being highlighted. The involvement of celebrities helped the campaign capture media attention and take the issue to new heights. Social media was no longer just a space to share information, but became a tool of power where people could contribute to societal change. However, this campaign also exerted immense pressure on politicians and authorities. Opponents of the reforms began to feel the push from public opinion on social media and civil rights organizations. Politicians and leaders who may have previously hesitated or remained on the sidelines were forced to speak out and join the debate on reform. David Miles and his allies realized that this was not just an issue with the police, but a comprehensive fight for justice in society. The pressure from social media forced politicians to no longer ignore the issue and compelled them to make strong commitments to advancing reforms, or else risk losing voter support. These campaigns demonstrated that in the digital age, social media can create real change when the government can no longer ignore the wave from the public. As a result, it was a major victory for civil rights groups and justice advocates. By leveraging the power of social media, they created an irresistible pressure on government agencies, forcing them to take more decisive actions in implementing reforms. Social media platforms created an environment where change did not only come from politics, but also from the solidarity of individuals and groups passionate about justice. In this way, civil rights groups achieved a historic victory, not only forcing the government to act, but also changing how major social issues are addressed in the modern era. Social media has become a powerful tool, helping communities not only fight for justice, but also transform the very structure of society, from legal policies to core values regarding human rights and equality. After a long period of debate and the implementation of police reforms, the new reform laws were finally passed and began to take effect. These steps were crucial to ensure that police officers would be held accountable for their actions and that justice would be enforced in all situations. The new laws not only required police officers to follow strict procedures, but also introduced tight supervision measures from independent organizations. These oversight agencies would monitor every action of the police, ensuring that any abuse of power or racial discrimination would be handled transparently and fairly. The government also committed to publicly disclosing information about incidents of police misconduct, creating a more transparent environment and helping the community feel more confident that the justice system would be properly implemented. However, enforcing these reform laws was no easy task. Although they were passed with strong support from civil rights organizations and the community, there were still significant obstacles in implementing these new measures. Many police officers and leaders within the police force remained skeptical about the effectiveness of the new laws. Some worried that with strict oversight procedures and high transparency requirements, the police would no longer have the freedom to act as before, potentially undermining their ability to uphold justice and maintain public order. These concerns stemmed from the fear that officers might be restricted in their power during necessary situations, especially when dealing with dangerous criminals. These individuals argued that overly strong reforms could create weakness in law enforcement, preventing officers from effectively responding to high-stress situations. Moreover, some politicians began to oppose the enforcement of these laws. They argued that the reforms would prevent the police force from ensuring security in a strict manner and could lead to a decline in the protection of the community. Some believed that overly strict regulations would prevent the police from acting swiftly in dangerous situations or making quick decisions. Conservative groups also voiced their opposition, claiming that police power needed to remain intact to protect the safety of the community. These objections made it difficult to enforce police reforms, as some officers and politicians still viewed these changes as a threat to social order. Despite the opposition and skepticism from some segments of society, reform supporters did not back down. They believed that oversight measures and transparency requirements were essential to rebuild trust within the community, especially for the minority groups that had long endured racial discrimination. David Miles and his supporters continued to maintain that, despite the challenges in enforcement, these laws were the right steps to ensure a transparent and fair justice system. Civil rights organizations continued to apply pressure on the government and relevant agencies to ensure that the reforms would not be delayed and that any abuses of power within the police force would not be overlooked. Ultimately, although challenges remained in the implementation of the new laws, positive changes began to emerge. Incidents of police misconduct were being addressed more transparently, and independent oversight agencies started to have a noticeable impact in ensuring fairness. The regulations on monitoring and reporting police behavior created an environment where the police were held accountable for their actions, gradually restoring public trust in the justice system. The initial steps in enforcing these reform laws demonstrated that, while not easy, change is possible, with persistence and cooperation from all parties. As the police reforms began to take effect, a small but significant incident occurred. A police officer, while performing his duties, failed to adhere to the newly implemented procedures in the reforms. This involved an unjustified traffic stop where the officer did not follow the required protocol of having oversight, providing the reason for the stop. Although the incident did not cause significant physical or property damage, it set a concerning precedent for non-compliance with the new oversight measures. Witnesses immediately filed complaints, and through an investigation, the officer's actions were taken seriously and addressed. This incident served not only as a warning to the officer, but also as a clear message that any violations of the new procedures would not be tolerated. The case quickly became an important lesson within the police force about adhering to the new regulations, setting a precedent for addressing future violations. David Miles and his supporters viewed this not just as an isolated incident, but as an opportunity to emphasize the importance of enforcing the new procedures rigorously. The community began to see that the government and police forces were not only implementing reforms, but were also actively monitoring and addressing violations, whether by low-ranking officers or high-ranking personnel. The investigation into this officer's behavior was conducted openly and transparently, resulting in the officer being temporarily suspended while awaiting the final conclusion. This decision was widely announced, setting an example for others in the police force and restoring public trust in the new oversight system. The outcome of this case not only clarified that police reforms were being implemented seriously, but also opened a new chapter in monitoring and checking police actions. Independent oversight agencies were empowered to handle violations and conduct regular checks on police conduct. This created a more transparent environment where the public could easily track and demand accountability from the police. The new procedures, with clear and strong penalties, not only increased the accountability of police officers, but also helped protect the rights of citizens, particularly those in minority communities. When misconduct cases were handled openly and transparently, the community felt that they could trust the justice system, and the tight police oversight made them feel safer. The implemented oversight policies began to show clear results in reducing misconduct within the police force. Incidents of abuse of power and racial discrimination were addressed seriously and publicly, creating a new model that public agencies had to follow. The monitoring process was no longer just a theoretical step, but had become a practical tool to track every action of the police and ensure that any violations were dealt with fairly. David and his allies recognized that although many challenges remained, significant progress had been made in the police reform process. This system, with clear and effective monitoring procedures, had begun to create a fair and transparent environment where everyone could feel that they were living in a society that protected the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or social status. After a long period of struggle, the community finally began to see significant changes in the police force and public institutions. The reforms implemented not only changed how the police carried out their duties, but also transformed how government agencies interacted with the community. Police officers now not only followed strict procedures, but also had to be accountable to the public, something that had never happened before. The community began to feel that their rights were being properly protected, and the abuses, racial discrimination, and injustices that had previously been rampant started to decrease. Civil rights groups, social organizations, and individuals fighting for justice recognized that the transparency and accountability of public agencies had improved, which strengthened their trust in the system more than ever. Although these changes have yielded many positive results, not everyone is pleased with them. Some factions in society, especially conservatives and certain groups within the police force, continued to resist the reforms, claiming that these measures had gone too far. They were concerned that reducing the power of the police would weaken their ability to protect the community and would be insufficient to deal with the growing crime rate. This opposition came not only from individuals but also from political groups and other conservative organizations, who felt that the implementation of these reforms would undermine the power they believed was necessary to maintain public order. These perspectives continued to create conflicts within society, as some felt that the drastic changes could lead to a loss of control over public safety. This divide not only appeared in public debates, but also in political meetings, where politicians and leaders had to face pressure from both the reform-supporting community and their opposition. Reform advocates argued that this was an essential step toward creating a fairer society, where police officers were not only law enforcers but also defenders of the community's rights. However, opponents feared that these reforms would weaken the police, making them unable to handle emergencies and crime effectively. These ongoing arguments continued to raise questions about many unresolved issues, as participants in the discussions struggled to find a solution that would satisfy all parties involved. However, reform advocates remained steadfast, recognizing that police reform was a crucial step toward a more just society. David Miles and his allies continued to emphasize that this change was not just about altering police behavior, but also needed to affect the way justice was implemented across all public agencies. David believed that despite opposition from conservative factions, transparent and fair justice was inevitable, and these objections would not deter him. To him, enforcing these changes was necessary to create an environment where everyone felt safe, regardless of race or social background. The process was not always easy, and opposition from conservative groups remained strong. But David and his allies knew that if the reforms were not fully implemented, all previous efforts would be in vain. He continued to push for a society without discrimination and a police force that did not abuse power, where justice was fair for all, without bias or favoritism. Though these changes were not perfect, they created a solid foundation for moving toward a future where justice was truly implemented. As the reforms in the police force began to take effect, a review of the changes in the industry was conducted to assess the effectiveness of the new measures. Authorities and independent oversight organizations collected statistics from databases, reports on police behavior, and the results of investigations. These figures were published widely and showed an encouraging result. incidents of misconduct and police abuse had decreased significantly. The reduction of racial discrimination cases, improper arrests, and abuses of power served as proof that the reforms were having a positive impact. This was not only a success for the police force, but also a sign that there was a shift in the mindset of the officers regarding their responsibilities and justice. The clear statistics demonstrated that oversight procedures and retraining measures had begun to create a fairer working environment, helping to restore community trust in the police force. Despite the remaining issues and challenges, the results from this review brought a wave of hope to all those who had fought for change within the police force. The community began to see real transformations in police behavior, with officers truly focusing on citizens' rights and working transparently and impartially. Some minority communities, who had previously faced discrimination and abuse of power, now felt safer when interacting with the police. This indicated that the reforms were not just legal regulations, but had genuinely impacted the behavior and attitudes of public servants. David Miles and his supporters viewed this outcome not just as a small victory, but as an important step in building a just society. The reduction in misconduct within the police force helped ensure that justice was carried out more fully and effectively, making sure that no one, regardless of their race or background, was treated unfairly. Efforts to build a harmonious relationship between the police and the community achieved notable success. The police were no longer solitary enforcers of the law, but worked alongside the community to protect the collective rights of society. However, despite the clear progress, David recognized that the process of change could not end here. To maintain and build on these results, he and his allies continued to push for additional initiatives aimed at enhancing accountability and transparency in all police activities. The reforms were not only about addressing police violations, but also about creating a new model for sustainable cooperation between public agencies and the community. This approach fostered a space where both sides could participate in the development and reform process, rather than maintaining a hierarchical structure where the police stood above the rights of the community. The story of justice and peace within the community was no longer just a simple struggle, but a long-term process of building. Through this, David and his reform supporters succeeded in creating a fairer society where everyone, from the police to the community, could live and work in an environment that respects and protects each other's rights. These reforms not only improved the police force, but also rebuilt trust in justice, proving that even small changes, if implemented seriously, can have a profound impact on society. With the positive changes achieved in the police force and society, David Miles recognized that one of the key factors in sustaining long-term change was educating the next generation. He called for lessons from the past to be taught in schools and communities, helping young people understand the importance of justice and equality. David believed that if future generations could be educated about the mistakes of the past and the important lessons from history, they would be better able to understand the value of justice and equality in society. These lessons were not just about stories of racism or police misconduct, but also about unity, resistance against injustice, and the change communities can create when they stand together. Schools and educational organizations began to develop new curricula, aiming to teach about the history of racial discrimination, justice protests, and the steps society has taken to change reality. However, this educational process was not always smooth. These lessons faced strong resistance from some groups in society who still held discriminatory views and did not want to accept that history needed to be fully acknowledged and taught. These individuals argued that teaching about racism and police misconduct could create division and cause young people to feel hurt or lose faith in society. Some believed these lessons could lead to a sense of guilt in the white community, as they might be seen as responsible for past acts of racism. Debates over how to teach the history of justice and racial discrimination became heated, as some parts of society felt these lessons only dredged up the past without contributing to the present. Others felt that these lessons were too critical and could diminish the spirit of unity within the community. They argued that focusing too much on issues of racism and police misconduct would divide society into opposing groups rather than promoting healing and harmony. These viewpoints continued to spark conflict in education, with a large portion of society unwilling to change the way history and social issues were taught. However, David Miles and his allies continued to advocate for education on these issues, believing that only by confronting and fully understanding history could society move forward in the right direction. David also recognized that this process would require persistence and time, as changing the perception of an entire community could not happen overnight. He continued to encourage young generations to participate in educational activities and discussions, urging them to learn more about the past, the mistakes society had made, and how we could do better in the future. Despite facing opposition from conservative groups, David believed that educating and raising awareness in the next generation would be the key to building a more just society, where human rights and justice were not just theories, but values enacted across all areas of life. These lessons, despite the resistance, would continue to be passed on, helping future generations not only understand the mistakes of the past, but also act to change the present, working toward a future free from racism and abuse of power. As reforms began to be implemented, a major debate emerged in society about how to educate future generations on justice and power. Despite resistance from some conservative groups who were reluctant to change traditional teaching methods, the discussion became more important than ever. Teachers, students, and educators began to engage in this dialogue, discussing how to incorporate justice and equality into the curriculum in a way that would be appropriate for all groups. Reform advocates argued that to create lasting social change, education must be the first step, and every generation must be taught about the mistakes of the past and the importance of justice. However, some still expressed concerns that teaching too much about issues like racism and police misconduct could cause division in society, rather than healing the wounds left by history. Nevertheless, this debate did not last indefinitely and quickly led to an important consensus. Teachers began to realize that to build a fairer society, they needed to incorporate lessons on human rights, justice, and the fight against racism into the curriculum. They also agreed that future generations needed to be equipped with the knowledge and skills to tackle current social issues, including equality and the participation of all groups in society. Students also began to gain a clearer understanding of the importance of justice, as they realized that these values were not just theoretical but had a direct impact on their daily lives. David Miles, with his leadership in this reform, emphasized that education was the foundation for ensuring lasting change in society. With this consensus, a comprehensive national education program on justice and equality was implemented. This program not only taught theoretical concepts of human rights and justice, but also included practical lessons, helping students understand the importance of power and how law enforcement and public agencies must work to protect everyone, regardless of race. Teachers were trained in new teaching methods to ensure they could convey these lessons in an engaging and understandable way. Students were also encouraged to participate in extracurricular activities, such as group discussions, peaceful protests, and community projects, so they could apply what they had learned and gain a deeper understanding of how social change can be driven. As a result, this educational program has had a profound impact on future generations. Students not only gained a clear understanding of their own rights, but also recognized the importance of justice and how a fair society can be built through education, dialogue, and collective action. The changes in education have created a strong foundation for the future, helping upcoming generations not only understand power, but also know how to wield that power to fight for justice and equality. These lessons have been and continue to create a powerful wave of change in society. A society where everyone can live and work in fairness, and where the mistakes of the past are no longer barriers but lessons for societal progress. When Martin Hayes left politics, many felt a deep sense of loss at the departure of a leader with such determination and influence. However, the reforms he initiated continued to be implemented and strengthened by those who followed. These reforms were not limited to changing the way the police operated, but extended across the entire public sector and society. New leaders, inspired by Martin's efforts, carried on the mission of change. They understood that for justice to truly be upheld, it required the participation of society as a whole, not just one group or organization. The reforms aimed to increase transparency in government actions, create an independent oversight system, and restore the public's trust in justice. Although no longer leading directly, Martin Hayes left a lasting mark on the reform movement. Politicians, activists, and social organizations continued to uphold and expand upon the measures he started. These measures not only made the police force more fair and transparent, but also ushered in a new era of social policies, where the rights of all citizens were protected, and no one was discriminated against or overlooked. The principles of justice and equality became the foundation for all new policies, ranging from improving education to building equitable systems in the legal framework. However, as the reforms were further implemented, conflict eventually arose, serving as a reminder that change is never easy and always faces resistance. While many supported the reforms, there were still those who did not want change, fearing a loss of power and control in society. Conservative groups continued to debate the measures taken within public institutions, fearing that the reforms would undermine social stability. They argued that the power of the police and other institutions was necessary to maintain security and order, and any changes would only make matters worse. These debates once again raised the question of power and justice in society, and whether the reforms would truly create a fairer society. Despite these ongoing resistances, the story ultimately offers an important lesson in justice. The changes that Martin Hayes and his successors initiated demonstrate that change does not only come from politics or major decisions by government institutions, but also from each individual in society. It is the small decisions made by individuals in the community, from listening and understanding one another to fighting for the rights of the oppressed, that create sustainable change. The reforms Martin started could not have persisted without the collaboration and collective effort of all levels of society. This is the profound lesson that those who follow must remember and act upon. The future of justice is not a straight line, but a long, enduring journey where people must constantly fight to maintain and develop the values of equality and human rights. Change, though significant progress has been made, still requires persistence and long-term commitment from everyone, from the government to each individual. David and those who follow cannot stop, as they understand that justice is a battle without an end point, and each generation must contribute to building a more just society for the next generation. Although the justice fight that Martin Hayes began has never truly ended, he understood that justice is a never-ending journey. While reforms have made significant strides, society still faces challenges, as racism and abuse of power persist across many layers. Martin recognized that reforms were not the end, but merely the beginning of a long and continuous process. Changes in law enforcement or public institutions can only be maintained with the participation of all society, where each individual must take responsibility for protecting justice and equality. Even though society has made great strides in changing the awareness and behavior of public institutions, Martin knew that each new generation would have to continue the fight to uphold these values and prevent discrimination or abuse from resurfacing. This battle never ends, but it is an essential part of creating a fair and equal society. Martin Hayes was not merely a leader in the police reform movement, but a symbol of the values society needs to strive for. He led this fight not just through political strategies, but through personal actions, conversations, and decisions that confronted the truth. He understood that justice is not something that can be achieved overnight. overnight, but a long, difficult process that requires patience and unity from everyone. Looking back at what had been accomplished, Martin realized that, while not everything could be changed immediately, he had laid a solid foundation for the next generation to continue fighting for justice. The career of Martin Hayes is not only measured by his political achievements, but also by the inspiration he sparked in those fighting for justice and human rights. Every step he took was a testament to his courage and steadfastness in facing difficulties and challenges. When Martin's political life came to an end, he left behind a profound legacy. Justice is never a destination, but an ongoing journey. The reforms he initiated will continue to be implemented and developed by future generations, as everyone in society must come together to protect these values. Ultimately, the story of Martin Hayes closes with a powerful message. Change begins with the individual. Every action, no matter how small, when done with dedication and responsibility, can create significant change in society. Martin not only fought for the rights of the people, but also inspired everyone in society to stand up for what is right. He became a symbol of a fair and equal society where each individual can contribute to building a solid foundation of justice for all. When Martin Hayes passed, he left behind a great legacy, a society where everyone could live in respect, regardless of race, religion, or background, and where justice is the right of all people. The story of David Miles and the police reform he initiated was not just a political struggle, but a long, challenging journey to build a fair and equal society. It all started when David realized that the issues of racism and police abuse of power could not be ignored. With support from civil rights organizations and the community, he resolutely pushed for wide-reaching reforms, not only within the police force, but across the entire public system. Protests, community dialogues, and changes in the way the police operated were significant milestones, but what truly made the difference was David's persistence and refusal to give up. With the support of allies, David achieved what once seemed impossible. He not only faced criticism from conservative forces, but also had to contend with deeply ingrained mindsets and long-standing practices within the police force. However, through his determination to bring change, he proved that a united and steadfast community can make a difference. The reforms David initiated not only reduced police abuse and racism, but also transformed the way society viewed justice and human rights. Surely, when society begins to see justice not only through legal frameworks, but also in how individuals treat each other, real change will have truly begun. This struggle was not solely David's. It reflects the involvement of everyone in society, from civil rights organizations to the police, and all those who stand up for the community's rights. Reform advocates were not just warriors in the battle against racism, but also those who created change through action and participation in discussions. David led, but also left a crucial message for future generations. Justice and equality are not just theoretical, but living values that can be implemented through the actions of each individual. However, opposition was inevitable. The division within society remained, as some argued that these reforms would weaken the police force and make society unsafe. Yet, through dialogue, reconciliation, and the community's involvement in the reform process, David helped prove that change is not a threat, but an opportunity to build a fairer society. In fact, these reforms actually helped strengthen the community's trust in the police and public institutions. Core values of justice and equality were reinforced and implemented. David Miles' story offers an important lesson for us all. Change is never easy, but it is essential to create a just society where everyone has the right to be protected, regardless of race or background. Justice is not just a concept, but a fundamental right that every person in society should enjoy. A just society is one where everyone has equal opportunities and where transparency, accountability, and respect for individual rights are always priority. David not only fought for the rights of minority communities, but also became a symbol of hope for those who believe a better society can become a reality.